And joining us now on the debate, David Naylor, the president of the University of Toronto, Alicia Ali, steering committee member for the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, Harvey Weingarten, president and CEO of the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, and David Trick, co-author of Academic Reform and a former assistant deputy minister on Ontario for post-secondary education. Good to have everybody here at our table today for a discussion about what we get from the university sector. And to start with, let's put up some numbers here, shall we? Here's some graphics about university income for the past fiscal year. Where does it all come from? Well, more than half comes from grants and contracts. That's basically tuition, tuition is next. That's provincial and federal money. About a third comes from tuition and fees, and then you can see smaller amounts coming from investments, donations, etc. Let's look at the other end of things. How about operating expenditures? Where does most of the money go? Not surprisingly, almost 2/3 for salaries and wages. And then if you add up that next 14%, about 3/4 in total, salaries, wages, employee benefits, scholarships and bursaries, a small amount, maintenance, etc., and other 13%. There we go. That's how it comes in and that's how it goes out. You four around this table are all in a perfect position to tell us whether you think we are getting, in exchange for the billions that you spend, good value going out. So let's go around on that. Mr. President, what do you say?
I think we get great value, Steve.
Great value?
Yep.
And you think so because why?
I think so because we have, if you look at the government funding, the lowest per student funding by a fair margin in Ontario. Even if you roll in tuitions, we're still 30% below the average of the other 9 provinces. And Ontario has one of the highest participation rates for universities, high graduation rate. We have, I think, a very strong case to say good value for money.
Alicia, what do you say?
Well, Steve, first of all, thanks for having me here today. Are we receiving value for the education we're receiving? I think we are to some extent. I go to McMaster. I've had a very great quality education throughout my 5 years there. But as the cost of our education continues to increase, students don't necessarily think that the value of the education is increasing alongside that. Over the past 6 years alone, tuition has increased by 5% per year. So over 6 years, that's a 40% increase. Has the value of our education increased 40%? Probably not. So are we getting good value education right now? Absolutely. But is the money that's going into the system equivalent to that? I don't really know. I don't really think so.
Harvey, what do you say?
I would say that we're getting very good value for the money that we're putting in. The Ontario University system has expanded greatly over the last 10 years to accommodate increased student demand. Students appear to be doing well when they finish. They're getting good jobs, they're earning well. We are still putting students into some of the best professional and graduate schools in the world. We are doing some terrific research in our universities. We have 2 universities in the system that are in the top 100 in the world. And frankly, we're doing all of that, as my colleague has suggested, at a lower end investment compared to other jurisdictions.
You don't mind me following up on one thing here. You say your students are graduating and getting good jobs. Most of the admittedly anecdotal evidence that we get on this program is that students are graduating more and better educated than ever, but their timing is lousy. They're not getting good jobs at all. In fact, most of them are doing jobs they think are well beneath them. Isn't that the case?
No, it's not the case. If you look at the economic analyses that are done across Canada, you would see that students from universities are getting jobs in high numbers. It does sometimes take them a little bit of time to get a job in their specific area for which they have taken a program or been educated. And everything we know says that there's a real earnings premium to them for having attained a university credential.
David Trick, we're putting billions in. Are we getting value out?
I think we're getting a lot of good things from our universities, but the problem is that we've actually given the universities more missions than anyone's prepared to pay for. So we want the faculty to be great teachers. We've added 130,000 more students over the past decade. We want the faculty to teach them well. At the same time, we want the faculty to be great researchers. We want them to drive the economy, create the innovation. So we've set up big pots of money. We've asked all the faculty to compete for those funds in order to get research grants. Well, of course, the faculty have 24 hours in a day like everybody else. So great researcher, great teacher, something's got to give. And in my opinion, what's giving is the quality of undergraduate education. So you see that in bigger classes. You see that in more faculty who are part-time faculty being hired specifically to teach the students. So the full-time faculty have time to do research. If you look at that situation and say, what's it doing to the quality of undergraduate education, I think you have reason to be concerned.
David Naylor, let me get you to follow up on that, because you've heard this criticism before. You can either be a great research institution or you can have great teachers. It's unlikely you can do both. What's your view?
I think that we have to work through whether or not every university is going to be equally involved in this research-intensive mission. And, you know, David's written about this, Harvey's written about it. I think this is a live debate right now in Canada and in Ontario. We have a lot of universities that want to do the same thing, and pretty standardized job descriptions for faculty. At U of T, a couple of things we've done I think have been helpful to get the balance right. One is 90% of our research-intensive faculty who won big awards, full chairs, etc., are in the undergraduate classroom. No one gets to skate away. Second thing that I think is important is to understand that that leavens the undergraduate teaching mission in interesting ways, right? Having someone who's defining a field teaching changes things a bit. Third thing you can do to try to help is make sure that you actually get a balance. So rather than having a whole bunch of 400-seat classes, you think of a bit of a bimodal approach. Over 40% of our arts and science students on the St. George campus are in 28-seat or smaller seminars for at least one course in their first year. They can't hide from discussion, debate, interchange, close evaluation. So, you find the balance. You get very big and very small, you make it work.
Is that your experience?
I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because if we're looking at classes of 600, 700 students, I think the reality of the sector right now is that enrollment is increasing and a lot of our campuses are experiencing capacity issues. Of about 10,000 students that were surveyed last year, when asked, do you want resources put into smaller class sizes or more effective training for professors, a majority of students would like to see better quality teaching in the classroom. I honestly think you can have a classroom of 600, 700 students, but if the professor is given the tools to teach well, to enhance the learning of the students, you could have a great class of 600 students. If we're going to have smaller classes of 20, at McMaster we have a lot of inquiry-based sort of classes. That's fantastic, but it can't be small for the sake of small. They have to be thoughtful, and it has to be providing students with the best possible experience, not just at the sake of having small classes, I guess.
Those 10,000 students you surveyed, is that province-wide?
Yes, province-wide.
Province-wide.
Yes.
That's interesting that they came back with that. I would have thought the opposite.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to students recognizing that as the cost of their education is increasing, the value isn't necessarily increasing alongside that. And like I said, quality, I think it's great in the classroom. I've taken a number of classes, like over the past 5 years, like I said, that have been 600, 700 students, and the professor spoke to me on a one-on-one level. But I've also, taken classes like that where I wanted to, fall asleep. So I think, as a matter of fact, it comes down to the resources we're using and how effectively we're using them in the system right now.
Let me get Harvey on this. This idea of finding the balance between those who are great teachers and great researchers, and who do you want at the head of the class when there's 600 people in the room. How do you figure that out?
Look, I think there are reasons to be concerned about the quality of instruction our undergraduates are getting, but we're not the only jurisdiction facing that challenge. And what's interesting to me is the question of how do you fix it? If you look around in Canada at other provinces, if you look at other countries around the world, many of them are trying to face this challenge of offering a higher quality education to more students with no more or less money. And what's interesting is that many of them, in fact, I'd say the great majority of them, have gravitated towards this concept of you can't treat every university the same. Mm-hmm. You have to have greater differentiation of the university system, and that's one of the levers, a very powerful lever you have to maintain quality, even in the face of diminishing resources.
I have heard this, though, David Trick, for 30 years, and I'm scratching my memory here, but wasn't there a guy named Fisher who wrote a report 30 years ago saying all these undergrad universities can't be teaching the same thing as everybody else in the same way, and we're still having this problem?
This is something that in Ontario has been talked about in various ways for more than 30 years. The prediction was that if we didn't do something to recognize more differences amongst the universities, the quality of education would start to suffer. And what have we seen over 30 years? We see, first of all, faculty, because they're under pressure to do more research, are spending fewer hours in the classroom. They used to teach about 3 courses a semester. Most of them are down to 2 courses a semester, sometimes less than that. We do see larger class sizes. So most of our students are at universities where 30% or more of the first-year classes are taught in sections of more than 100. That means about 80% of the seats are in sections of more than 100, which is the experience we have of 4 out of 5 first-year classes being in very, very large lectures. And in some of the big faculties, more than half the teaching is done by part-time faculty. So you put these things together and you start to say, well, why are people doing this? Is it to improve the quality of teaching? Well, actually, it's to manage budget issues. And we should think about what the future university is going to look like. If current trends will continue, the university of the future is going to have a small cluster of full-time faculty doing research and a huge constellation of part-time faculty doing the teaching.
Okay, but we're not there right now. We're
not there yet.
We're at where we're at.
But
And I
the
wanna know
progression we're going to is exactly in that direction.
But when you were working in the Ontario government, in the civil service of the Ontario government, and you would make these points presumably to the minister of the day, where did that go?
Okay, first of all, we have a pretty strong tradition in Ontario of every institution being treated equally. And so there's a very strong view that fairness requires everybody to get a certain share of whatever dollars available. And so you have to look beyond sort of just fairly dividing up the dollars to say, well, what's a fair balance across the whole province? Can we really afford to have a university system where we now have 20 universities? Can each and every one of them grow up to have a full panoply of graduate programs, professional programs, medicine, law, and
Everybody
so on?
agrees the answer is no, but everybody's still chasing, right? Every university president, no offense, still wants everything on his or her campus, right?
That's exactly what happens. So at some sort of a provincial level, you need to have a plan that says this is what we need as a province. Collectively, this is what these 13 people need. Let's make sure that somewhere in the province we have enough medical schools, enough law schools, enough PhD programs. But let's not pretend that anyone could ever afford to have 20 universities and have them all be comprehensive and all be very, very high quality.
Do you, I mean, you got the biggest one, U of T, so let's just hit this on the head here. I presume when you go to your university presidents' meetings, you've got university presidents from, I won't even have to name them, but smaller institutions who come up to you and say, David, enough already. You guys have already got all the money. What do you need this for as well? Share some, give us a few crumbs off the edge of your table, please.
Well, first off, it's not clear to me that per student funding, which is level, as David said, is going to be higher at U of T, right? This is part of the problem, that there's no allowance in per student funding for the amount of research that's done or the prominence of faculty and so on. So I don't think anyone is particularly envious of our per student funding. In fact, doing more research, because the federal government pays a very small amount of the overhead costs, so-called, of research, means you lose more money.
Yeah, but you got rich alumni who make up for it.
We certainly appreciate your support, Steve. Thank you.
That was not
We'd love more.
That was not a reference to me, but nice going anyway, though. Good shot.
Yeah. Anyway, from the standpoint of differentiation, I think it's so important to understand that no one's talking about typecasting universities, right? This isn't California where you've got 3 tiers, colleges, state universities, and the research intensives. What I think would make sense is clear missions for each university respecting its unique attributes, some clarity, multi-year accountability tied to that mission. And I think that would break some of the gridlock in the system.
Whose responsibility is it to do that?
I think the ministry has already said they want to move in this direction, and in fairness, the university presidents have already agreed that some clarity of mission would be a good thing. So this is just a matter of getting on with it. But it's not going to be easy. There's going to be some haggling about who does what. Final thing I want to say is there is already some differentiation in the system, right? There are some institutions that do more research. There are some that have medical schools, law schools, etc. There are others that have more of an undergraduate focus. The question is not whether there is or isn't differentiation. The question is sharpening it, clarifying it, funding appropriately.
Let me get you on this.
To be honest with you, differentiation means different things to different people.
What does it mean to you?
In the context of research and teaching, which is sort of how I've looked at it, to have research only versus teaching only universities, I think there needs to be a balance. And when you're a high school student and you're off to university and you have to choose between a teaching university and a research university, that's a little unacceptable. There needs to be a balance between what we're offering our students to enhance the quality of their education. Because at the end of the day, we want our institutions to create well-rounded people, individuals who can compete against each other in the economy. And if we're creating one-sided students. We're not actually giving students their bang for their buck.
Harvey?
Look, we wrote about 2 years ago a report for the Ontario government on the benefits of differentiating the university system even more. We acknowledge that there is some. We made the case that the system and the students and the public would benefit from greater differentiation. But to be clear, we did not advocate, nor do we think it's advisable in Ontario to have teaching-only or universities and then some only research-only universities.
Everybody's got to do a bit of something.
Everyone's going to do a bit of something. But let's also be clear, the universities are different. They have different aspirations, they have different niches, they serve different regions, they serve different types of students. And if you do differentiation well, and you tie it to the mission of the university, every university can do what it does best, even better. And that requires an intelligent, purposeful conversation between the institutions and the government. The government has to make sure that the system as a whole delivers to Ontario, to the public and to the students, what Ontario needs out of this system. But not every institution has to do exactly what every other one does.
As you know, David Trick, our friend over here, has been banging the drums for reform on this for a while, and he's co-authored a new book called Academic Reform. And I want to read just a small excerpt from the book, and then we can talk about some of the points that he makes here. Here we go. After observing behaviors in Ontario over the last 2 decades, we think we can assert with confidence that most faculty members would prefer to, or feel compelled to, spend an additional hour on scholarly work rather than on teaching work. Most faculty associations would push for a 5% increase in salary rather than increase faculty numbers by 5%. Most institutions would prefer to spend an additional $100,000 in salary budget to hire a rising research star who will spend 50% of his or her time on research and 30% on teaching, rather than hiring a star teacher who would spend 30% of his or her time on research and 50% on teaching. Okay, well, first of all, let's start with this. You think that's really where we are today?
I think that's really what the incentives drive institutions to do and then drive individual faculty to do.
Which presumably you think is perverse.
It's really not what you want as a public. Okay? What you want is a balanced system where you're sending a large number of students to university and they're getting a great education. And so if you're responsible for this as a provincial government, one of your missions has to be how you change the incentives so you get all the things that the people need from their university system. You want great teaching, you want great research. You don't have to have exactly the same proportion of it from every institution. You also want to recognize differentiation doesn't just mean teaching versus research. Institutions can differentiate themselves according to what kind of students they serve, what kind of programs they offer.
Sure, and where they are. Obviously,
where they are.
Northern schools are going to teach different things.
Sure.
Ones down here.
So the ways that universities teach, we have, Waterloo distinguished itself originally for co-op education. Other universities could distinguish themselves for online education, other kinds of modes of education.
Is that happening?
You see it everywhere, but there's no obvious plan for how it's going to arise or where it's going to go. You see individual cases of individual faculty, sometimes universities, doing good things. And you say, well, what does this add up to? And is it anywhere near as strong in terms of incentive to do that as opposed to the incentive to go out and get more research grants?
Harvey, do you think he's lined it up properly here?
Yes, with a footnote.
Go ahead.
And the footnote is...
We read footnotes here.
Yes, and the footnote is that you want a balanced system. That doesn't mean you want every institution to look the same. So, for example, it may be the case that we do want some universities where professors spend 50% of their time doing research and teach predominantly, but I would not argue exclusively, graduate students. I'm mindful of the fact that when I look at President Naylor and I look at the University of Toronto and the universities around the world that they are competing with, most of those institutions are considerably smaller than the University of Toronto, and those universities have more graduate students than undergraduates. So if we want a competitive system, we have to allow each institution to do the maximal amount given its mission, its capacity, and distinctive characteristics.
Okay, but here's a problem, right? The incentives are misaligned. So to follow through on your comment about perverse incentives, if you do more research, then there's more of a drain on the budget. This view that research is, simply a money spinner, wrong. Right? The province pays 40 cents on top of the dollar of operating costs on a grant. Well, we know our costs are about 53 cents on average. Federal government currently to the University of Toronto pays 17 cents. So that's 36 cents gone for every dollar of direct research funding from the federal government. So the net result is you have a cash drain doing research. Now it enlivens the institution, lifts the whole institution in many ways.
But it's not good for your bottom line.
But it's not good for the bottom line. Now let's go to graduate studies. Doctoral students, competitive situation, you're going to discount tuitions, provide a stipend. Well, you know, when provinces and federal governments don't provide the same number of graduate fellowships to match growth in graduate enrollment, you're looking at dipping into grants, you're looking at trying to find slush funds, you're looking at fundraising. Net result is many of the things that institutions want to do to be more research intensive end up costing them money. So we have a bit of a misalignment in Canada where we actually penalize the places that are more research intensive, even as the culture of the university system says everyone should be more research intensive. It's a pretty strange system.
If you look, if we go to your question, why hasn't this happened over 30 years in Ontario? If we look at those places where it has happened, other provinces and other countries, the government has driven that discussion. If the government doesn't take the lead in the differentiation discussion, it won't happen spontaneously.
Are they in Ontario?
Well, certainly the messages coming out of the ministry now are, yes, about distinctive mission statements, aligning funding with mission. We just need to get on with that agenda if, in fact, we're going to move in some of these directions.
Okay, but these guys have been in power for 8 years. Are you saying this is only starting to happen now?
When I look at the things coming out of the ministry, yes, I'd say that it's really in the last year or so that there's been much more discussion.
Footnote coming, footnote from President Naylor.
I do want to just say the government has actually made differential allocations of graduate student numbers tied to things like granting council envelopes and missions of institutions and their record of graduate studies and research. They have been careful about some of the expansion. So I think over the last several years, they've sent some pretty clear signals. But it's pretty un-Canadian, right? This is not the Canadian way. The Canadian way is peanut butter, spread thinly and evenly. A little bit of crunch here and there, but otherwise spread it out.
Everybody gets something.
Yeah, sure.
So we're spitting in a traditional wind here, if you like.
Well, I don't want to apologize for the last 8 years. I mean, the government can run on its own record. It doesn't need me to defend it. But I do think that steps have been taken to promote differentiation in a constructive and limited way. And the question now is, let's start talking it through and doing it more systematically. With Alicia's important footnote, as I said, I don't favor a California system with typecasting, but I do favor a little more nuanced discussion and clarity.
Let me circle back to something you talked about a moment ago and then get you to follow up on it. My hunch is that students would like the opportunity to learn from professors who do research. I suspect students would also like those professors to be available to them and to know how to teach properly. Yes. Not just be good researchers, but actually be, you know, good people at the front of a classroom to listen to. How do you balance those two priorities?
Yeah, well, I'm glad actually President Naylor touched on this point. Right now we have research chairs at a lot of our institutions. I think we spend about $500,000 per research chair from a government perspective.
And we have lured a lot of big shots from other jurisdictions to come here as a result.
Yeah, and it's been great for our institutions. What it did is it created an imbalance at our universities, and there's a culture of research, which has its benefits. You know, a lot of students, specifically in science and engineering, I think, value undergraduate research opportunities. But realistically, from a cost-benefit analysis, we could create teaching chairs at each of our institutions for about $20,000 each.
Teaching chairs?
Teaching
as
chairs.
Opposed to research chairs?
Yes. So what this is essentially is a parallel to the already existing research chairs, where a professor sort of can take a leave of absence from their research for a year, and will spend a year developing and researching teaching pedagogies, which they can then share with their colleagues, determine best practices, and then they're required to implement the teaching practice at their institution.
Who's promoting this idea?
The Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, we're doing that right now. Yeah, we've been lobbying on this for the past year, actually, and there are currently 4 universities in Ontario which have such systems.
David, how do you like this idea?
I think it's a terrific idea.
We're making any headway with it?
I'll add one more here, which is I think we ought to start measuring what students are actually learning while they're at university.
How do you do that?
Okay. The Americans have actually started doing this, and there are a few institutions in Ontario that have agreed to start doing it as well. There's a test called the Collegiate Learning Assessment that tries to measure what have students actually learned in university on some basic skills that every university says that they teach. So critical thinking, being able to communicate effectively in writing, being able to solve problems. And by administering this test, you start to get a picture of what are students actually picking up by way of those core skills. What did they know when they came in? What do they know when they leave? There's a terrific book that's been written this past year called Academically Adrift that looked at exactly this question in the United States. And the results, frankly, were quite shocking. What they discovered was, looked at students when they came in, after 2 years, 46% of them had not improved in the course of those 2 years.
Had not improved
Had
at
not
what?
improved in critical thinking, being able to write effectively, being able to solve problems.
That's distressing.
At the end of 4 years, 36% still had not improved. So now
fault is
this
that?
was a fairly small sample size, about a little over 2,000 students who
But
were
why
actually
would that
looked
be the
at.
case?
Why would it be? Well, they speculate in the book, and of course they don't have the ability to say what happened to every student. But the speculation was, well, to the extent that the students did learn something, they learned, well, I'll call it disciplinary knowledge. So you study history, you learned a lot of good facts about history or good facts about physics, whatever it was you studied. But the main things that universities say they teach in terms of developing people's intellect, developing their mental capacity, these were not things that students were picking up during the course of their time in
I
university.
want to ask David Naylor about this because I think we've got, 50,000 plus students, about 5 subway stops south of us right now on your downtown campus. How do we know whether or not they are improving at all of the things that other David here has been measuring and making sure that they're better students after 3 or 4 years of being at your place?
Number one, you have a very strong tradition of curricular development that emphasizes just these points. Number two, by making sure that students are in smaller classes, either that small seminar class in the first year or smaller classes in the upper years, which we do. There's no place to hide. Essays are written, they're evaluated, they're read. Pretty hard to get away without being able to communicate in writing in those small classes in upper years in a good school. So I take the point, but I'm very skeptical about how practical this is going to be. Here's a simple example. Unless this is sort of regulated, you're in your 4th year, you're exiting, and someone says, hey, in addition to your 5 exams here in April, in your 4th year, write another one to mollify the bureaucrats as to how perfect your education is. I have a feeling, thinking back more years than I want to admit to my undergraduate days, what my response to that might be. So let's think this through and figure it out. But I have some degree of skepticism about whether in the Canadian context you're going to find in this relatively more homogeneous system the same bad outcomes. But happy to hear about David's views.
Go ahead, Harvey.
He has skepticism, I have a sense of urgency, and I'm glad we're actually on to the topic of what are our students learning, are they learning the right things, and how do we know what they're learning? So much of our discussion has been differentiation on the basis of research. Who's going to do research, which university is going to do it, how much? But if we look there, as David has said, there's other ways to differentiate. One of the great differentiators in medical education in Ontario, pioneers, was McMaster Medical School. Mm-hmm. It was an education innovation. When I look at certain colleges in the United States, Swarthmore, Reed College, liberal arts undergraduate, they produce brilliant students. Yep. They are not researchers, they are distinguished, and they are understood to be high quality, high reputation because of the teaching they do. So I would say this. I think we need to catch up to where the Americans and the Europeans and many other parts of the world are in terms of measuring what it is our students know and can do when they graduate.
Do you think a student evaluation of their education and or the people who taught them is worth much?
I don't think it's a student evaluation. Again, we are doing research now with colleges and universities in Ontario to articulate what it is that a student, for example, who graduates in a social science discipline, health and life sciences, or physical or social sciences discipline should know and be able to do when they graduate. We are conducting a study on behalf of the Government of Ontario looking at the learning outcomes in civil engineering, comparing it to 7 other countries around the world. There is a great movement around the world to say, look, you come to a post-secondary, a college or university, and we know you come because you're supposed to be a better communicator, problem solver, engaged citizen, critical thinker. If we believe that, let's measure those things.
Yeah, but
And we can measure
you know,
those things.
Just on this, there's a real need to be careful about specific attributes versus generic attributes. Talk about civil engineering, Harvey. You know, these are accredited programs. There's, you know, pretty clear catechism, as it were, same as in medical schools. We can differ in how we teach. Most people use problem-oriented learning now in medicine. But in the final analysis, there's a pretty clear body of knowledge. What I think is intriguing is the attempt to get to generic attributes, right? Good citizenship as measured by X, Y, and Z. All I'm saying is I'm empathetic, supportive in general of the concept. We got to be so careful about how we do that, because I'm not sure at times what we're going to measure in terms of critical thinking, in terms of problem solving. And it would be nice to see how these standardized tests translate into what actually matters. What matters is whether or not 10 years out, the graduates are thriving, making a difference in the world, presumably making a decent living, contributing. And I'd like to see some correlation between some of these test scores and test attributes and what I think we all want, which is better people.
Where we would agree is we should measure the things that are important. And right now, we spend a lot of time measuring whether they have absorbed the content in their discipline. And we need to do better than that.
So not everybody agrees on what's important.
I don't agree about this view of it all being about content. I think, you know, in an excellent undergraduate school, McMaster, many others, you were provost there for many years, I think students in the upper years are actually being compelled to communicate effectively. If you're in a program where you're writing an essay, you gotta make your case. It's not just about the content. You're not regurgitating facts. You've got to make a case, make an argument.
I want to know whether, and I'll go to you on this, Alicia. We mentioned 55,000 students at the St. George campus at U of T. I think just, 25 minutes north of us here, north and west at the Kiel campus of York University, they've got the same number of students. Are some of our post-secondary institutions getting too big to be able to offer the kind of valuable education we've been talking about here today?
To some extent, yes. Like I said earlier, the campus capacity issues are overwhelming. Should we be creating new campuses to deal with that? I don't think that the money is most effectively used in new campuses. I think we need to work on what we already have and put the resources to create new buildings, more academic buildings on our campuses.
The province has talked about creating 3 new universities.
Yeah, teaching-focused universities at that. And that goes back to our point on differentiation. Should we be having teaching-focused universities? I don't think so.
And you don't even want the bricks and mortar for those, do you?
The thing is, we're teaching a lot of different types of students, and I think it's a mistake not to offer a variety of different experiences for them. If you look at the city of Toronto, you mentioned those 2 campuses. Toronto is the only city in North America with 2 universities of that size, 2 university campuses.
A big city.
Those 2 are in the top 6 in North America. A few other cities have 1 such campus, but we have 2 of them. So if you want to go to school, you go to university in the city of Toronto, you better like being on a very, very large campus, because the number of seats in any other campus, is really not very, very large. You're very likely to end up on a very large campus, one of those 2. So my own opinion is that we have lots of students who don't thrive on those kinds of campuses, would do much better in university, but much more likely to go to university if we had some campuses of a smaller scale. As I look to the future, in Ontario, we're going to need somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 more university seats by the year 2025.
50 to 100,000 more?
Somewhere between 50 and 100,000 more. The city in the GTA, we're going to need somewhere between 30 and 70,000 more.
And we don't want to spend any more money to get it.
So people don't necessarily want to spend a lot more money to get it. On the other hand, we don't have much history in this province of saying, sorry, you're well qualified, but we're not going to make a seat for you. So I think somebody's going to have to make room for those students. And we're going to have to say, do we really want your largest campus to add 20,000 more students and York University to add 20,000 more students? Those are already extremely large campuses.
I can tell you the answer. We have no appetite for growth on the St. George campus. And if anything, we would look at perhaps a little bit of reduction in the undergraduate numbers. We still have a huge commitment to undergraduate teaching on that campus.
How about Scarborough, Mississauga?
They can grow a bit.
They can grow a bit?
A few
we're out of
thousand.
time. Okay. We have no more room for growth here. We're done with time. David Naylor, President of the University of Toronto. Alicia Ali, Steering Committee Member for the Ontario Undergrad Student Alliance. Harvey Weingarten, President and CEO of the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And David Trick, former ADM for Post-Secondary Education in Ontario. Academic Reform is his latest book. Thanks, everybody, for this discussion tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.